Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Person-Centered Supports for People Living with Dementia in the Community. We are excited to have as many people as we see joining us. As people are streaming in to our Zoom webinar, we will stay on this introduction slide for about 1 minute as people join. And again, we are tremendously appreciative of all of you who are taking time out on this Monday, November 30th, to join us for this important conversation. With that, could we go to the next slide, please? So I would like to, my name is Alex Bonardi. I am one of the co-directors of the National Center on Advancing Person-Centered Practices and Systems. And I'm joined by my colleague, Bevan Croft, who you will be hearing from later during today's webinar. Today's webinar is titled Person-Centered Supports for People Living with Dementia in the Community. And we are delighted to be able to present this webinar series, which is sponsored as part of the National Center on Advancing Person-Centered Practices and Systems, which is funded by the Administration for Community Living and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. All these webinars are free and open to the public. They are recorded and are available on our website, as you will see in later slides. Next slide, please. The goal of the National Center on Advancing Person-Centered Practices and Systems is to promote systems change that makes person-centered principles not just an aspiration, but a reality in the lives of people across the lifespan. This is something that we work towards in a number of different ways through our center, and one of the ways is through these webinars that are available publicly. Next slide, please. Thank you. Just a few quick webinar logistics. All participants are muted during this webinar. You can use the chat feature in Zoom to post questions and communicate with the hosts. Please note that when you are posting, you should post for questions to all panelists and attendees if you want everybody to see your comments and your questions. We leave the chat feature open, and we are delighted. In many cases, there are many great conversations and resources shared. Toward the end of the webinar, our speakers will have an opportunity to respond to questions that have been entered into chat, so please go ahead and do that. This webinar is live captioned in English and Spanish. The English captioning can be accessed by clicking the closed caption button at the bottom of your Zoom platform. And the Spanish captions are available through the link that is on your screen and also will be dropped into chat. This live webinar includes polls and evaluation questions, so please be prepared to interact as we move through this session. Next slide, please. The webinar recording, as I've mentioned, along with a PDF version of slides and a plain language summary of the conversation, will be available on the NCAP's website, ncaps.acl.gov. We will also include questions and responses in the materials that are posted following the webinar. After the webinar, you can send follow-up questions and feedback about the webinar to the email address ncaps@hsri.org. But please note this email address is not monitored during the webinar. If you'd like to contact our team, probably the chat is the best way to do that. Next. So this is our first question. For all of our people participating, we want to know who's here. There is a poll that should be coming up on your slide, on your screen right now. And we ask that people select how you self-identify. This is really helpful for us, for our team to know who's participating, and also for our panelists to know who they are speaking to. It looks like we've got over 500 people participating in this webinar. This is a large group of people that are joining us, and we are so appreciative of this. It's great to know how people self-identify. I'll give people another couple seconds and then we will close the poll and we can share the results. So we have nearly half of the people participating would identify as social worker, counselor, or care manager. This is helpful. This is also showing that this is a great presentation for this group. We're also excited that we have people who use long-term supports and services, people with disabilities joining us, as well as family members, self-advocates, and peer specialists. As well as a large number of people also who identify as government employees and people from provider organizations. This is a great spread of people who are participating. We're excited you are all with us. Thank you. Next slide, please. We are joined today by a terrific group of panelists, and each person will be introduced and have more of an opportunity to speak about themselves shortly. But I just wanted to let everybody know that along with all of you who just responded to the poll, we also have panelists Brian Van Buren, Cameron Camp, Elias Rodriguez, and Reverend Cynthia Huling Hummel. Each will be presenting their own stories and having what I think will be a really rich and exciting conversation. Before we get to the conversation, there's a little bit of laying the groundwork that I'm going to go through. And in this presentation, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about definitions for person-centered thinking, planning, and practice, a description, briefly, of the population of people living with dementia in the United States. And then importantly, we're going to hear from and share experience of supports for people with dementia living in the community from the perspective of providers and from people with lived experience of living with dementia. And as part of that, we'll be discussing strategies for supporting people living with dementia, and we're really excited to hear from this. Our National Center for Advancing Person-Centered Practices and Systems puts forward these definitions of person-centered thinking, person-centered planning, and person-centered practice. Person-centered thinking is an approach that we suggest is a foundational principle which requires consistency in language, values, and actions to place the person at the center. The person and their loved ones are the experts in their own lives, and there is an equal emphasis on quality of life, well-being, and informed choice to make decisions about what's important and how people want to live their lives. Person-centered planning is what we define as the methodology that involves learning about a person's preferences and interests for a desired life, and the supports, both paid and unpaid, that people would like to be able to achieve their desired life. Person-centered planning, the process itself, is directed by the person, supported by others who are chosen by the person who is engaged in the planning effort. And then all of this comes together also in the context of person-centered practices. This is where the alignment of services and systems really come together to make sure the person has access to full benefits of community living. Service delivery that really facilitates the achievement of the person's desired outcomes. And so all of these things need to be in place to achieve truly person-centered systems. Next slide, please. In our work at NCAPS, we often hear from people that when we ask about what is person-centered to someone, they can tell us, well, I know what isn't person-centered. And often what people describe is a system of supports that is really very system focused. And so this is why we wanted to present a little bit of this content. With the systems focus, the limitations a person has is what is used to define the person. Supports are defined as services that people can become eligible for based on the extent of their, quote, impairment. These are the kinds of language that one can see in a systems-focused system that really is all about meeting the needs of the system and more importantly than perhaps the needs of people who are receiving supports or who need supports. The supports are driven by the needs of the system. In a person-centered approach, and this is the direction that we are trying to support systems to move towards, people recognize that a person brings their own unique capabilities and contributions with strengths and preferences, and also recognize that there may be challenges that come with a disability in planning for a future life. So what that means is that there may be supports needed to actually start the planning process and to think through what's important. A person-centered system of supports builds capacity of the person based on who they are. And here's an example. When you think about some people who may be very naturally gregarious, very interested in being part of a large group of people, if someone needs support, it may be that the supports they need come more from their community, from their circle of supports. They really choose to have people call them and give them reminders, perhaps, about when it's time to take a medicine. There might be other people who really are less interested in having that kind of routine connection around that kind of thing. And they may be more interested in, for example, having technology give them reminders or technological supports for other things. And this is where person-centered supports can really meet what the needs of the person are. Next slide, please. We have a person-centered advisory and leadership group within NCAPS, and this is a quote from one of the members of our group, Kimberly Mills. And her quote is beautiful and says, "One of our most important rights as human beings and sovereign citizens is our right to pursue our goals, our dreams, our loves, and the things that make us happy. This is something that all people want and need. It fulfills us and makes our lives more rich and valuable. And person-centered planning is a thoughtful, research-based, and beautiful process which helps provide the foundation for people with disabilities, people living with dementia, to also experience the joys of living a self-determined life." And that's the foundation that I want to leave you with. Next slide, please. So very briefly, an overview of the United States population living with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. According to most recent report, 5.8 million Americans of all ages are living with Alzheimer's dementia in 2019. This includes approximately 200,000 people under the age of 65 who have younger onset Alzheimer's disease. Different causes of dementia are associated with distinct symptom patterns, and so it is important to receive an accurate diagnosis to ensure that people receive treatment and follow-up care that's appropriate to their specific form of dementia, and this is sometimes care called person-centered care as well. I also want to point out that that dementia and Alzheimer's disease is not experienced equally across races in the United States. Among people aged 65 and older, African Americans have the highest prevalence of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias at 14%, followed by Hispanics, followed by non-Hispanic whites at 10%, American Indians and Alaska Native population at 9%, and Asian and Pacific Islander population at 8.4%. Next slide, please. And importantly, to discuss supports, we also want to talk about caregiving or provision of care and supports. In 2018, caregivers of people with Alzheimer's or other dementias are estimated to have provided 18.5 billion hours of informal, unpaid assistance. So that is unpaid assistance. And when we talk about paid assistance, direct care workers provide the majority of care in home or residential settings. And in many cases, staff need support themselves in order to provide person-centered care. And this is where I'm excited. We're about to move into a conversation with both providers of care and people living with dementia. Person-centered planning, person-centered thinking provide a means to help support providers provide both what is important to the person living with dementia, as well as what is important for the person living with dementia. Next slide, please. And with that, I would like to turn us over to our panel discussion, which will be led and facilitated by Reverend Cynthia Huling Hummel. Dr. Cynthia Huling Hummel of Elmira, New York, is a fierce advocate and a voice for those living with dementia. Cynthia served on the National Council of Alzheimer's Research, Care, and Services, representing the 5.8 million Americans living with dementia. She's been an Alzheimer's research participant for 10 years. Cynthia currently serves as an advisor to several local, national, and international organizations. Excuse me. As an artist and author, she also sings in a country band. She will be moderating our discussion. And with that, thank you, Cynthia, for joining us. And I'm going to turn this over to you to invite the rest of our panelists to join.
Well, thank you so much. And hello, everyone. It's my joy and my pleasure to be with you today. I'd like to introduce you to Brian Van Buren. Brian is an Alzheimer's advocate and public speaker. Brian is a member of the Western Carolina chapter of the Alzheimer's Association, and he is an advisory council member for Dementia Action Alliance. After his early onset Alzheimer's diagnosis in 2015, he reimagined himself as an advocate. Being an Afro-American man, he felt he needed to give a face to the disease, and he also feels the need to address marginalized populations, such as the LGBTQ community. Next, I would like to introduce you to Cameron J. Camp, PhD, who originally developed the adaptation of a Montessori method as an intervention for persons living with dementia. Cameron is a noted psychologist specializing in applied research in gerontology and currently serves as the Director of Research and Development for the Center for Applied Research in Dementia. He gives workshops internationally on cognitive and behavioral interventions to reduce the challenging behaviors and increase the level of functioning and quality of life of persons living with dementia. And then I'd like to introduce you to Elias Rodriguez, a registered nurse who works as a community life director at Rowan Gardens Senior Living Community. His passion for comfort and best practices has made him an advocate for quality care. As an ambitious and motivated leader, he spends his days seeking the highest quality of life for employees and residents in his community. We're going to spend the next 10 minutes or so just with a little bit of reflection. And so I would like to invite the panelists to reflect on these questions. Brian, we're going to start with you. Here are the questions I'd like you to consider. So how did you get involved in advocating for person-centered supports for people living with dementia? And how do the different parts of your identity, for example, race, sexual orientation, how do they shape your perspective on person-centered supports for people with dementia? And why are you so passionate about your work? Brian? Oh, we need to unmute you, my friend.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Brian Van Buren, and I presently live in Charlotte, North Carolina, part of the time, the rest of the time in Rio de Janeiro with my husband in Brazil. But because of the virus, I have not seen him since March. So basically I am living alone. I became an advocate because I saw a need. After I got diagnosed, I started doing research, and I was appalled to see that Afro-Americans were diagnosed twice the rate that the general population was. But yet, all the conferences and things I attended, I never saw another Afro-American. So I didn't think they existed. Well, I was lucky enough to have a Afro-American couple come to Charlotte to do a book signing. It was B. Smith and her husband, Dan Gaspy. Very well-known couple, and B was the first Black model on many, many magazines. She owned 3 restaurants. She had things in various stores, and she was a frequent guest on the Today Show where she did cooking demonstrations. So she was doing a cooking demonstration, which she had done maybe 20 times, and all of a sudden couldn't remember what she was doing or where she was. And that was kind of the start of her journey. Shortly after that, she got diagnosed with Alzheimer's. They felt it was very important to give a face to Alzheimer's to assist people in the Afro-American community. So I went to the book signing, and after Dan spoke, I stood up and announced to the room that I had just been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and just burst into tears. Dan came from the stage and embraced me and held me. And he said, "I've got you, my brother," and held me for like 5 minutes. And then he said, "You have done something very brave. You have now given a face to this disease. I am very proud of you. But now you have a responsibility to go out and show that face to the world so that they can see that you are a person who's living well with Alzheimer's." Was the other part of the question, Cynthia?
Oh, that's okay. Yeah. So I'm just curious about how did you, once you got your diagnosis, how that has shaped your idea of person-centered supports. You know, you get your diagnosis from a doctor, you leave the office. What supports were in place? What were you longing for or hoping for that maybe weren't? So we can learn from that.
I was hoping for some sort of support, and I was lucky enough to get on the computer and find the Alzheimer's Association, Western chapter in Charlotte. And it just so happened they were starting a support group for people who were early onset people. And so I got involved in that group, and that just kind of led me to getting involved with so many different groups. I have been invited to so many conferences. I've been in the TV, radio, magazine, newspaper. Last year, I went to South Africa and did the first memory cafe that they had ever had on Alzheimer's. This became a passion for me. Prior to my diagnosis, I was an international flight attendant for 20 years. And people think that's a very glamorous job. You know, you're in Paris one week, and you're in London the next week, and you're in Germany the next week. But the reality of it is it's a very lonely, sad profession. I did that for 20 years. And to be honest with you, I just existed. I did not have a life. I wasn't involved in anything. And many people find this strange, but I need to say that being diagnosed with Alzheimer's was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it gave me a purpose. It gave me a reason to get involved. And I have just really, really, really enjoyed what I'm doing and the number of people I've met. And I know that I'm helping and I'm assisting people. So that's my my new calling, and it's great.
I'm so grateful for your friendship and so grateful for your advocacy. I'm going to just move on and see Cameron, if you would like to reflect on the same questions that I asked of Brian, in terms of how you have gotten involved in advocating and why you're so passionate about the work you're doing.
Certainly. My original research was working with younger and older adults, teaching them how to remember things better. And I moved to New Orleans and began doing work in adult day centers. And in Kenner, Louisiana, a suburb of New Orleans, they had the first day center in the country specifically for people with dementia. And so I came in there, and everything that I had tried in the past that was successful was useless in terms of how to get a person with dementia to remember things better. All of the mental imagery and all of these things that require a lot of effort just did not work. And so I had to find a different way. And at the same time, my children started a Montessori school. And I walked into that classroom and saw how these children learn by doing. And they learn through a different memory system, one that involves unconscious learning, effortless learning. And I brought a neuropsychologist I knew into the classroom and I said, "You think this is the way forward?" And not only did he say yes, but he enrolled his children in the school. And so that was like an epiphany for me. I'll give you an example. I was at the day center and there were a group of women there who were white. Everyone there had dementia. And a new client came in, an African-American male. And he walked over towards these women and they told him to go away. They called him a number of racial slurs. The staff went over to him and said, "How can you treat this man this way? How can you call yourselves Christians and treat a man like this?" And they said, "You're right, we're sorry, it won't happen again." And then that memory left their memory systems because of dementia. And the next time he approached them, decades worth of socialization kicked in. And so the staff said, "Make them stop." And so I said to him, do you ever give things to people here that they like to receive? So, well, we have games, we have prizes. All right. I said, I was a Latin speaking altar boy. I forgive you. Rig the games and let these women win every game for the next 2 weeks. However, from this moment on, this man, this new client, gives out all good things at this center. All good things flow through and only through him. And this is an example of that unconscious learning system. In this case, it's called a conditioned emotional response. The feelings that a person elicits in you by how they interact with you become associated with that person. Even if you can't remember episodes, you can learn to like somebody or hate somebody based on how they consistently make you feel. So I came back in a month and I said, "Are they calling him names anymore?" "No, he is their friend." And they say he has always been their friend. They go way back. And what was happening was they were learning to like him. And they had to try to figure out, why should I like this guy? And the urban legend grew. Well, I've known him for a long time. My family knew his family. And so it was a simple thing, but it was a way to change the nature of that relationship. And so we've been using this approach for a long time in a lot of different places. My wife and I were visiting a nursing home in Switzerland where they used Montessori approaches, where the residents decide, the people with dementia decide what they're going to do that day, what social causes they're going to support, how they're going to take care of their own community, where they want to go for outings. And two of the people living there read us a welcoming speech in English because they were taking an English language class taught by another resident who spoke multiple languages. And I'll never forget the ending of their speech. They said, "We want to thank you for giving us back our liberty." And so you can't have those kind of experiences and not be changed. And so this is what we're about. This is about human rights. It's about liberty. And when I'm in France, I always say, you have these words on your flags and on your buildings: liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, fraternity. How can you take those away from a citizen because of a diagnosis? And so it's always been about human rights, person-centered care. Maria Montessori was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 3 times because she was an advocate for human rights, not just a way of creating education. So that's sort of my background. My wife was a Montessori teacher for over 20 years. 2 children went through the schools, and it's a way of living. So that's what we're about.
Thank you. Elias, I would love to hear from you and what what has captured your passion about this work? What is it that you do that brings you such joy as you advocate for person-centered supports and work with the people in your community to create those supports? Tell us more.
Hi, Cynthia. Thank you so much. I can tell you that I'm a trained registered nurse, so I went through nursing school. And as I went through nursing school, I feel like I got the basic training that most nurses likely get. And so we kind of skimmed over dementia. We learned about it. We learned a little bit about what it entailed physiologically. And so then we went out and did our clinicals. Soon after I graduated, I got a job in in-home care. I was doing home visits throughout the community and had several experiences with persons living with dementia. And so most of the training came from other nurses that had been in the field for a long time. So I realized that a lot of the ways that I approached persons living with dementia were from nurses who passed down their knowledge and their experiences. And that's kind of how I was navigating my nursing career. And I was given an opportunity to work in a senior living organization. And so when I arrived here, we had several members of the community that were persons living with dementia. And soon after, on a fateful day, we were working with a consulting group, Monarch Pathways, and they happened to connect us with a wonderful man who spoke right before myself, and that was Dr. Cameron Camp. And he walked through the doors with a little bit of ray of light and had some new weird approaches, as I thought. We were talking about Montessori, which had always been on signs for schools. And we learned about this approach. And what I learned was that it really wasn't earth-shattering. It wasn't difficult. It was an easy approach in which you started to see things change very dramatically. And what I noticed was it was this person-centered approach. I started looking at a person as an individual versus as a group diagnosis. And that really changed everything from that moment on. And I started to see that if we personalize things for each individual person, their response was so much better for both parties. It was a pleasant experience for everyone. And it really happened on day one. After we got a little bit of the training and started learning about Montessori inspired lifestyle, day one, I noticed that the interactions were just different. They were pleasant. They were likely what I would want if I were on the other side of that communication. How would I like to be approached? How would I like to be asked? What kind of things do I want to do versus do we have to do as a group? And I think one of the things you had asked were what kind of things in my own identity, I think you may have asked Brian. And I love Star Wars. I love competitive board games. I hope that I can have that incorporated in my care, and I want to be able to have things in my room. So I realized that those little things, those personalization things, really go a long way, both in trust, in emotions, in bonds, and everyone kind of just has a better experience. Every day is better as a result.
Thank you so much for your insights. You can just feel the passion when you talk about how it made a difference in your work and environment and in the day-to-day interactions. I was thinking about my own experience when I was diagnosed in 2011 with amnestic mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's disease. I left with a diagnosis, but there weren't a lot of things that were already set up, at that time for people who were living by themselves and also who had a dementia diagnosis and didn't have a care partner. So I was just curious, and we'll carry this back to my friend Brian, if we may, since we have a few more minutes. Brian, you're a person who lives alone. When we talked about person-centered care, did you run into any obstacles looking for the care that you needed or wanted? I was thinking about so often, at least in my experience, trying to find a place where I could get some support or some care, but I was limited by the fact that I lived alone. Brian, was that your experience?
Absolutely not. What I did was I put together a treatment team. I had a speech therapist, I had a psychologist, my general practitioner, and even I got my church involved. So I had support from pretty much every other corner. And it was important to have all these people in my life because they really assisted me. When I first got diagnosed, I could barely speak a sentence because my memory was just gone. So she worked with me for about 6 months. So I was able to get my speech back and once again be able to talk. And she helped me with my cognitive skills as well. So it's available out there. You just have to know where to go. You have to know where to look and, just go for it.
So we really have to learn how to be advocates for ourselves, to ask for what we need and to keep asking until we find it. But knowing about this wonderful resource through NCAPS, it's great for us to have this as an additional resource. I'm wondering, as we look to the panelists for your insights on this, if there is one lesson that you have learned on this journey, if there's strategies that you have found that work for people that help make them person-centered. So I guess that's a two pieces to that question. Cameron, what lesson have you learned on this journey, and what makes something person-centered?
One of the most important things I've learned is that persons with dementia can still learn. It depends on how they're taught, but persons with dementia can still acquire new habits, new skills. They can also recover function. I mean, you just heard from Brian about regaining better speech capacity. I know of instances, for example, where a physician would not write a prescription for rehabilitation for a person just because they had the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. And the justification was, well, they have Alzheimer's, they can't learn anything new, and so rehabilitation, these services would be wasted on them. And this was for a friend of mine who had been a medical director at a long-term care community, and he was not being given this prescription for rehabilitation. I mean, for me, this was like personal. And fighting against that stigma and fighting against the negative stereotypes that are out there and that are prevalent is really what I've learned has to become like my cause. I tell people I don't have a job, I have a mission. And there's a difference, and it is a mission. It's about changing the way people think. It's a revolution in the sense that Galileo said the earth is not the center of the universe, the sun is the center, the earth revolves around the sun. This was a revolutionary idea. It changed the way people thought. Person-centered care, we should put the person at the center. We revolve around the person. It is a revolutionary idea. And so that was like my awakening. And I remember my wife and I having dinner with a woman named Christine Bryden in Australia, who has written a number of books on living with dementia, the last one being Nothing About Us Without Us, as its title. And she had been the science advisor to the Australian Prime Minister. And she said, when I was given my diagnosis, my neurologist wrote me basically a prescription for disengaging from life. He said, here's what you won't be able to do anymore. And he listed them. And Christine said, I told him to go to bloody hell.
Good for her.
Yeah. And she handed us her new business card, which said, surprisingly enough, advocate. And she went on to become an incredible advocate for persons living with dementia and fighting for their rights. So encountering those sort of rebellious spirits along the journey also has been awakening for me. And just personally, I have a daughter in her 40s who's learning disabled. And so I'm like a lifer in terms of dealing with people with cognitive disabilities. And so it's always been kind of front and center, but meeting these amazing people and having these experiences has just really pushed this into high gear. It's time for a change. It's time for a revolution in the way we think about dementia as a society.
Thank you for your insights. I'm going to ask Elias, what are the strategies that are working well for you and the people that you serve, and what makes them person-centered? And if you have one lesson to share that you've gained on your journey, can you share that with us?
Yeah, I remember having a pretty powerful experience. Like Dr. Cameron Camp said, it's changing the way that you think, which also changes the way that you approach different situations. And I remember we had a reading group, and we had, I think it was 8 community members, residents, that were lined up, all persons living with dementia. And we were going to have a reading group, and they were randomly selected. And Dr. Cameron Camp didn't have any background on any of them. So one of the community members there, we had assumed for a few years that didn't speak and couldn't really understand or listen, hear what we were saying. And so, they were part of the group, and we thought, okay, well, let's see how this goes. And what happened was they gave each of them a book or a pamphlet that had large print, spaced out, easy to read booklets. And to everyone's absolute shock, not only did she read it, but she read it beautifully. We hadn't even heard her voice before. And it was as though the way in which we were communicating, we thought had to be auditory. We'd have to have a verbal response. Reading turned out to be something that she really enjoyed. And so we started writing communication and getting responses. It was jaw-dropping. That experience was pretty eye-opening as well. Thinking differently, approaching differently, maybe doing something we hadn't really thought of is trying to use multiple different ways of communicating versus saying, oh, well, they can't really respond when I ask them a question, which is what, I think was the way it was approached in the past before kind of this person-centered. So I'd say that some of the things that changed were the way to approach, the way to ask questions, the way to think. And so some of the strategies have been preparing that environment, making it a opportunity for success, as high an opportunity for success as possible. And that's in knowing that individual and making it person-centered and personalized for them to give them the best opportunity for success. And you start building confidence. And so more and more likely to try something different, try something new, try something that may have been uncomfortable before, but having so many little victories and building that trust is how I think we've been able to see some of our community members really thrive in ways I don't think we would have thought of before that. So some of the strategies I would say would be preparing the environment, asking in a way that was more for permission, would you like instead of could you? And then maybe just remembering that it doesn't take a lot of effort. It's a human experience. It's a way of approaching them in a kind, loving way, a way that I would like to be approached, the way that most of us would like to be approached. And it creates an emotion, like Dr. Camp was saying previously, that they'll remember. The next time I go into that room, that community member will remember, hey, every time I talk to Elias, I leave feeling pretty good. So it really helps long-term as well.
It sounds like communication is key and not making assumptions about what people can or cannot do.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Brian, go right ahead.
I left one person out in my support team, and that was the life coach, who I see every week. Her specialty is working with people with dementia and Alzheimer's. There's a lot of things that come with being diagnosed, such as agitation, depression, various other things, and paranoia. And I would be paranoid sometimes that people are out to get me. So I would sit down with her, and she was able to focus me and help me realize that what I was imagining wasn't real. But that has been the best thing for me to do. I just went on the computer and looked up life coaches and found found this woman, and that was her specialty. And she has helped me get through this disease.
So I was going to ask you if there was a lesson that jumped out in you that you'd like to share with other people. Maybe somebody who's going to the doctors tomorrow who might get a dementia diagnosis. What would be your advice, or what was your lesson that you would want to share with them moving forward?
Don't believe the doctor. Quite often, they will tell you to go home and get your affairs in order. They give you no assistance whatsoever in living your life with Alzheimer's. Life does not end. And so, unfortunately, you have to really just kind of go out, seek, and look. And like I said, it's available, it's out there. And there are a lot of people who are supporting you now because of this disease. It's so well known. I wear a button that says "Advocate Living with Dementia" all the time, and I get people approaching me when they see my button, and we get into conversation. And I can't tell you how many referrals I have given people for neurologists and support groups and things like that. It even got me out of a $400 speeding ticket. I was driving down the road, and speed limit was 35, and I was doing 60, not paying attention. I looked up and I saw the lights, and I thought, oh, gee.
Oh, boy.
Policeman came up to my window, registration and license, please. He said, this is a $400 ticket. So he went back to his car, and I'm thinking, oh, well, I'm toast. So he came back, he looked at my button a couple of times, and he said, why are you wearing that button? So I explained to him about what it was like to have Alzheimer's. And he said, my mother is showing signs of what you're talking about. Do you think I should have her tested? And I said, yes. And he said, have a nice day and forget about your ticket.
That's a story to be sure. Oh, my goodness. So I am very curious. Life has changed for so many of us with this pandemic. And I'm curious how it has affected your experiences of living with dementia, in Brian's case, or working with people who have Alzheimer's or another dementia. And I'd like to ask this question, and I'll start with you, Elias, is how do person-centered supports look and feel different now? If you look at pre-COVID-19, and now we're currently in the midst of COVID-19, how are things different for you and your community that you're working with and in?
Yeah, I'd say the pandemic definitely further changed our perspective and approach and way of thinking. But one thing that having the Montessori inspired lifestyle really prepared us for is having that individualization when someone initially moves in. So we are able to get a lot more information and ask a lot more questions to be more person-centered and more personalized when someone does move in, so that we can do our very best to personalize their care. And so in this instance, when somebody moves in and during a pandemic, they're not able to see their family members as frequently as they would normally want to or are able to. Some people would see every single day. That wasn't a possibility during the pandemic in locations like mine. And so we had to think about thinking outside the box and thinking, okay, we have technology at our fingertips. Should we use technology, and how do we incorporate using the community members or the residents, persons living with dementia, in that process? And so we started using devices such as the Facebook portal so that we can have video chats. We tried Zoom, we tried FaceTime on the iPhone and the iPad, and it allowed us to kind of bridge a little bit of the gap in the difficulty in seeing someone in person and having the ability to communicate with family. And what we noticed was the first time that it happened was an awkward conversation, a little bit of an awkward experience. It was kind of wondering what this whole thing was. But as the frequency increased, the comfort really grew, and they were able to have really great conversations, laughing, I miss you, I love you, can't wait to see you, like real conversation through that video chat that I think we all were kind of skeptical on whether this would be, an appropriate way to compensate for some of that, as well as some religious services. Some of the community members that have a religious background that wanted to attend a service But during this pandemic experience, we're not able to do so. We were able to find creative ways of streaming services, having FaceTimes with the pastor that they may have had in the past that they felt comfortable with, doing things that allowed them to have some relative uniformity in an ever-changing environment during COVID. So I think it allowed us to be adaptive, and knowing that the community members that we have, persons living with dementia, would be able to adapt and change if we gave them the opportunity and prepared that environment in a way that they could jump along with us.
Thank you for your insights and your sharing. Brian, I'm going to ask you, how do person-centered supports, how do they look and feel different from before COVID, you know, the pre-COVID times, and currently we're in the midst of this pandemic? How have things changed for you?
Well, unfortunately, I belong to an international group called Couch Surfing. I joined it about 3 years ago because, you know, I was living alone, I was isolated. And so anyway, it's an international organization very similar to Airbnb, but it's free. So people send you email requesting to crash at your place. They're from all over the world, different occupations. And for the last 3 years, I've had over 120 guests stay with me. But since this COVID virus thing, I haven't had any guests since March, and I'm really longing to have that interaction once again with people. I do have two roommates who really help me, Alexa and Siri. I talk to Alexa every day, and she's pretty smart. But one of the things she does for me is when I come into the house, I tell Alexa where I put my keys. She tells me when to take my medication. She tells me when I have meetings. She's a great roommate. You don't have to fight with her. But that has really, really helped a lot. And then as far as medication is concerned, I'm on 13 different pills. And initially they wanted to send me 90-day supplies for 13 different prescriptions. So you can imagine how difficult it would have been to try to put this pill in this box and this box and this box. So I inquired about having a home health nurse come in, and they said that Medicare said it didn't qualify. So she turned me onto a pharmacy that bubble wraps my medication so that all I have to do is punch out the day and take my meds, and it's just been so much easier. So, I mean, technology and various other things work. There's also a movement to make places dementia friendly. I belong to an international organization out of London that we're working on making airports dementia friendly. It's very difficult to travel when you have Alzheimer's, but I have a business card that I give to the customer service rep that tells them that I have Alzheimer's, and they allow me to board the plane before everyone else so that I can get situated. And if I'm changing planes, they will have someone meet me at the plane and take me to my next flight. So, I mean, that's all part of teaching people what the needs are for us.
Thank you, my friend. Cameron, with regard to COVID-19, kind of before COVID-19, now we're in the midst of COVID-19, how have you noticed, or what have you noticed in terms of how things feel different with regard to person-centered care planning, or working with people on setting up a plan? What's changed in your mind?
I think that the biggest change, the biggest challenge is that you can't literally see in person people that you used to see. And that disconnection in terms of social links has had a really profound impact. And not just for the persons with dementia, but also for the people living with them. And in places like where Elias works, for the staff who may not be able to see each other like they did before. So this disconnection, this social disconnection, has had a profound impact. It's a human thing. When you add on to that memory deficits, that makes it even worse. And so once again, it's about finding ways to circumvent deficits. So for example, some of our colleagues in France worked with their clients with dementia to come up with some signage that describes what COVID is in very straightforward terms, why people are wearing masks, why people are not able to visit the way they used to, the frequency or in person, so that it can be a reminder of why things are the way they are. Also, if you're having a mask, it helps to also have your photograph next to your name so that people understand who you are. Little things like that to get past some of the fear that a masked person coming into your room can exhibit. But there's another thing, and that is that, sometimes I hear people say, well, we don't want to make persons with dementia afraid and tell them about COVID, as if they have to be protected all the time from reality and from the world. And what we're seeing in other places who take a different approach, like where Elias works, is these are persons who've been through so many other things. I mean, I remember being in a high school gymnasium as a child getting vaccinated for polio and what that was like and how we were afraid to go to swimming pools before that. And these people who have lived through these things, through so many crises, depression, are a resource. And so in some places, staff have chats one-on-one with persons with dementia, and they ask, how did you get through it? What gave you the strength to keep going on? How did you survive? And so it also gives us an opportunity to make these very human connections, to look at a person who may have dementia during this time of COVID as a resource, as a repository of wisdom and life experience that they can share. And so giving that opportunity both to the person with dementia and to the person who's younger than them, I think is an opportunity if we want to take advantage of it. It's about embracing our humanity and knowing the person, and again, always cycling back to person-centered living.
Thanks. Elias, I'm going to ask you a question about if there's something that has happened during this pandemic, if there might be a positive change that you would love to see retained or maybe continue beyond the pandemic, something that maybe we didn't see before that we embraced and maybe in your mind should be considered for continuation.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we focused on quite a bit was purpose. People that had a lot of purpose before the pandemic, whether they were involved in groups or doing things. We had a few advocates of bridge. Bridge was almost a religion. They had to play bridge twice a day at different times. And so it was finding ways in which to still have purpose. And I think one of the things that came out of this was involving community members, the residents that live here, in the problem solving and having that really open discussion with some of those difficult conversations related to visits. In at least in California, where I'm from, it's been pretty stringent as far as visitors being able to enter places like the ones in which I work. And so having to adapt a way to still have safe visitations, we decided to incorporate the community members in every step of the way. And as a result, it created a great solution that everyone was involved with and everyone was happy with at the end of the day. And when it came to having to modify it, because another thing came down through California Department of Public Health, again, incorporated, reevaluated. So it's been a really wonderful way to have this great communication and work with staff and community members all throughout our community. And I really think that's going to continue. And I think that whether it's going to be what we want for breakfast in 2022 or something else, we're always going to be able to incorporate these communication pathways we developed.
I love that idea of involving the residents in your community and how do we solve this together? What are your ideas? and just having that opportunity to be able to weigh in, that must lift people's esteem and idea of themselves. Great idea.
Yeah.
Brian, I'm going to come to you, my friend, and see if you can think of something that has changed during the pandemic, a positive change that you would love to see continued beyond the pandemic. Oh, we need to unmute you.
Offhand, I can't think of anything at the moment, but let me think about it.
If you think about something, just wave, okay? So I'll throw that to Cameron.
I think that the combination of realizing that persons with dementia can learn and realizing that they can utilize technology with assistance to be able to communicate with people at a distance, I think that trend just so accelerated during COVID. And as Elias was talking about, it's a step-by-step process, but you get small increments of improvement until a person can be comfortable with a new technology, even though they have dementia. And I also think that because of COVID, people may cherish their relationships more and cherish the opportunity to connect more. You know, I will never personally ever take for granted a visit with my grandchildren. And to not be able to see them and to hold them and to at least be able to play Candyland with them on FaceTime, I will take that. But when I can see them in person, I will be different in the way I think about that and how I feel than before COVID.
I was reflecting on your comment about how people with dementia can learn new skills and even learn technical skills. And so I was thinking about myself. My old church asked me if I would learn to be able to do Facebook Live so I could preach the services. They were looking for my assistance. And, you know, we had to go through all the steps. I had to write them down. I had to practice. In the beginning, I couldn't have any chats up. It was too much of a distraction. I had to have a little card up there. And eventually, once I was familiar with all the steps, then I could start peeking occasionally at who was on or saying something. But just giving people a chance and an opportunity to try and learn new things. Yep. Thank you for sharing that. Would any of the other panelists like to share any other ideas on how we can continue to embrace different ideas for person-centered care beyond the pandemic or during the pandemic? Anybody? Elias.
The one last thing I wanted to mention is I also have said the communication has increased in other ways. People that were maybe visiting once a month are now calling every day. And that's a lot more communication than there was before the pandemic. So there have been positives in particularly in communication in other ways other than in person. But I will also say there's been quite a few family dynamics that were strained. There may have not been talking anymore or any sort of issues in that regard that have resolved as a result of this. People have decided that it's pointless to continue to be upset about something that happened many years ago. And there's been a lot of resolutions and a lot more communication on the phone and, like we were saying, video chat. So I think it's in some ways even mended some relationships that may not have been mended otherwise. And so there have been other positives, I think, through COVID if we keep an optimistic eye.
Mm-hmm. Last thoughts for everybody as we begin to wind down. If you have anything else you'd like to share, just a word of wisdom, an experience that you think might help another organization or another family as they deal with a dementia diagnosis, something that you've learned that you think is important to share. You're on the screen right now, Elias. Why don't we start with you and then we'll go to Cameron and then Brian.
All I can say is just try. It doesn't hurt to try. Give it your best effort to try something different, try something new, ask in a different way, approach it with the opportunity for success being front of mind. How can I make this as easy and best as possible, and remembering that at the end of the day, it's fulfilling for both parties. It's a kind approach, it's a human approach, and I think it's wonderful just to give it a try.
Thank you. Cameron, last words.
I was talking with a person who was a caregiver at home for a spouse who had early onset Alzheimer's disease. And the caregiver was saying, I keep putting up signs, don't do this. And then they do something else. And I put up another sign, don't do this. And they do something else, put up another sign. It's like playing whack-a-mole. What am I supposed to do? And I said, perhaps if you put up signs encouraging them to do things that they can do, perhaps if you guided them in terms of how they can contribute. Why are they doing this? Because they want to contribute to the household, to the family. They want purpose. They want to do things. And you're telling them what they can't do, and then asking them to figure out, well, what should I try now? Why are we surprised at this? Let's look at the strengths that your spouse has. Let's look at the social roles, the things they can do based on those strengths. Let's guide them in terms of time and place when they can do these things, how they can help you in meaningful ways. Let's focus on who this person is as opposed to what they've lost.
Oh, I like that message a lot. So often when somebody gets a dementia diagnosis, it's you can't drive, you can't work, you can't do this, you can't, instead of embracing the things that people still are able to do. Good for you. Thank you for those words of wisdom.
I noticed in the chat room, one of the questions a person asked was, why aren't there more people on panels and webinars who have dementia and Alzheimer's? And believe it or not, that has really changed a lot through Dementia Action Alliance. They realized that people with Alzheimer's are the experts, not those people sitting on the stage with all those letters behind their name. So they've really pushed to include us in so many things. You want to tell them a little bit about the white paper for the Academy of Sciences in DC, Cynthia?
Oh yeah, Brian and I are both serving on an advisory panel for the National Academies of Sciences for the decadal study. And we put together a survey of people living with dementia and care partners that would inform the advisory committee's writing of their proposal for research. And so we've had the opportunity to interact with researchers and to put together this paper, and it has been very well received. So again, as Cameron said, look to what people are still able to do and how we're still able to make a difference. Don't look at what we're not able to do. Focus on the positive. So thank you for bringing that one up, Brian. Good. Well, we're coming to the end of our time here, and we're going to turn the microphone back to, I think, Bevan is going to come on next and talk about or address some of the Q&A. Is that right, Bevan?
That's right.
All right.
Well, thank you so much, Cynthia, for your facilitation of this conversation. I have learned a lot, and I appreciate you and appreciate Brian, Cameron, and Elias as well. We've gotten some really great questions in chat, and I've been sort of jotting them down. And if you have other questions, please do feel free to put them in. I'm pretty certain we'll have more questions than we'll have time to answer, but never fear. We, as we always do, we will post written response, give our panelists opportunities to respond to give written responses to questions that didn't get answered, and we'll post those on our website in a few weeks. So thanks again. We got sort of a family of questions. A lot of people really just looking for resources and information. Someone said, my family has recently been noticing some signs with my mother. How would you recommend addressing this? So those types of questions. And then also a couple of questions around peer support groups for people for people living with dementia, and also for families and caregivers. So I wanted to first put that to all four of you. If you could share sort of your go-to resources and advice that you give to somebody who's looking for resources. But before you do that, I would also like to invite anyone to put into chat, because we have lots of knowledge, so we can also crowdsource this question. So if folks want to also put into chat any links or resources that you find helpful, we can compile all of those and put them together as well. So Cynthia, now that the tables have turned and you're now part of the panel, would you like to share first?
Yeah, I often, when I'm speaking, get the question, what should I do? I'm nervous about my spouse, my parent, myself, and cognitive changes. And I always encourage people to make an appointment with their primary care physician or their provider, and to get things checked out, to have a thorough examination, to eliminate what things are. Don't immediately jump to the conclusion that you have dementia. It's really important to have that conversation. The Alzheimer's Association has the 10 warning signs as one of their resources. We can put a link to that, which is a little handy guide that can be a way to guide a discussion if your time is limited with a provider, to say, these are the changes and the challenges I've been noticing, and then that becomes the benchmark. But it's always important to have things checked out. That's my starting point.
Great, thanks, Cynthia. Any recommendations for peer support groups that you found particularly helpful, either for yourself or for families?
Yeah, I belong to several support groups. I belong to an African American support group. Initially, the Alzheimer's Association tried to start a group, and they had white facilitators, and nobody ever came. So someone got the bright idea, well, maybe we should have Afro-American facilitators. So that group has about 30 people that meets once a month. And we have guest speakers, and we've gotten books for people to read, and just have really given a lot of information, because for a lot of Afro-Americans, they have no clue what to do once they've been diagnosed. The doctor doesn't tell you what to do. So we kind of assist that. The sad part, though, however, is that for many Afro-Americans, they keep it a secret, like it's something that shouldn't be shared. And that's just the history of the Afro-American people. We don't share anything. What goes on stays in your house. You don't share nothing, especially when it comes to medical things. I am a strong advocate for research studies, and partly because my grandfather was part of the Tuskegee study, and he died in the 50s from syphilis. And so a lot of Afro-Americans are suspicious to the medical system. And what I say is that was something that was a very dark period in our history, but we need to move forward because we need to have participation of all races in these studies.
Wow, Brian.
There's a group called Dementia Alliance International. It is an organization of persons with dementia who advocate for human rights and for the rights of persons with dementia. They have a voice with the World Health Organization, for example. And so Dementia Alliance International is a nice group to find out more about also, just to throw that out there for you.
I'd like to just add to that, Dementia Action Alliance. Brian and I are both on the advisory council. It's a great group. They have lots of different activities, supports, and services, and it's very collegial, and a lot of opportunities to participate in many different ways. So there's a number that the Alzheimer's Association has as well, 24-hour hotline, 800-272-3900. And that's for anybody who has a question about dementia. It's helpful for care partners. It's helpful for people living with dementia. And then if you have a specific diagnosis, for example, Lewy body or frontotemporal, there are different groups that specifically help people who have those diagnoses. So we can put that contact information as well.
One of the things I wanted to say is that there is no charge to participate in any of these support groups.
Right. That's
right.
important.
Yeah.
And many are led by people with dementia.
Yeah.
That's the other thing too. So that's important for people to know.
Right.
Great. Elias, any to add?
Wow, that was so good. I feel embarrassed to even talk. But just to say the local research hospitals, if you have any local research hospitals in your area, they often have variety of different support groups. And if you go to their website, you can usually find support groups related to the different diagnoses. So that's where we found some of our best ones.
Great. Thank you. And just remembering, if you did, we got a ton of crowdsourced resources, which is fabulous. If you did put in a resource, I tried to ping a couple people, but I didn't have time. If you put in something, make sure you selected all panelists and attendees, and then everyone can see it. But regardless, we'll be compiling all of these and we'll post them online. And for folks who joined late, this recording and slides will also be posted on our website, ncaps.acl.gov, in a couple weeks. Okay, onward. I have a question, Cynthia, that I'd like you and also Brian to respond to, and everyone else if you would like. We got a couple of questions, just being curious about how the church's involvement, the church community's involvement in your circle of support. So the question initially was for you, Brian, but I thought, Cynthia, given your background, you might also have something to say.
Well, thank you. Yeah, as a pastor, it's really delights me to see so many faith communities involved in dementia friendly community activities. Many of our houses of worship will have memory cafes, or a time during the month when they'll invite people to come in and participate in an art activity, or a choir, a memory choir. There's lots of ways that our faith communities can involve people who are living with dementia and care partners. Many house support groups. Many have people who will do respite care, who have been trained to go into people's homes so that somebody can attend a service. Some have special services for people with dementia. I know every year I lead a service on World Dementia Day. So as we remember September 21st, people living with dementia, there's many ways that people and congregations can be involved. And I invite people to reach out to their leadership team in their faith community, whether it be a rabbi or a pastor or imam, and just talk about what you can do. Even during this time of pandemic, there's ways to make connections and to make things easier for people living with dementia and care partners. Brian, over to you.
Yes. One of the things is, if you don't talk about it, people do not know about it.
Yeah.
So I stood up one Sunday in church and announced to the congregation that I had Alzheimer's. And believe it or not, there were 9 other people as well in our congregation who all have Alzheimer's. So they have formed a support group for us. I get a call like every other day from the pastor checking on me to make sure I'm okay. A couple of weeks ago, I went to church with my clothes inside out, and one of the church members took me aside and she said, Brian, your clothes are inside out. So I wasn't offended. I went in the bathroom and changed my clothes. So, had she not known that, I don't know what would have happened, but those kind of supports are really wonderful.
Right. One thing we've done is, for example, when a priest is giving communion, just one example, is to have some other persons with dementia next to them, one holding a sign which says Holy Communion, okay, with the large print, so that they understand now the context of what's going on. And when a person understands the context, that's very different than if someone suddenly stands in front of you and holds out a piece of bread. All right. And then also another person to have a tray with small little cups of water so that the person can swallow the bread without the problems they might have if they didn't have that. And so by, again, thinking about how to accommodate, how to change the process to make it more inclusive and to circumvent deficits, you can give people back the capacity to take part in that side of their spiritual life that's so important. And also to think in terms of, what sort of homily you give, what sort of presentation, and the speed with which you speak, and the length of your sentences. It's about accommodating to the people rather than asking them to accommodate to you. So little things like that can make access to spiritual life much easier. But it's about, again, person-centered. How can we create person-centered worship for persons with dementia?
Amen.
Great. Amen. Brian and Cynthia, you have both mentioned memory cafes. For those of us who don't know what that is, could you tell us a bit about what a memory cafe is?
I'm happy to jump in on that. Memory cafes are gatherings of people. They can take place in congregational settings, like we've been talking about churches or other faith communities. But they can happen in terms of some of the Office on Aging programs. They're gathering places where people can come for coffee and conversation, where they can play a board game, do an art project, just have conversation with other people living with dementia. Care partners often will gather to one side and chat with one another, and they might have bingo or singing activities, some sort of chair exercise. They're just a lot of fun. They're often just drop in. Many times they're free. But again, you want to call ahead of time in case there's an intake process. They most likely want to know that you're coming and what kind of accommodations you might need. Some are welcoming to people coming alone, and some require that you be in a didactic relationship, that you have a care partner. So again, it's just the community, and just check it out. They're wonderful places to gather and reminisce. Reminiscing is a wonderful activity as we talk about our past, the things that we do remember. So thanks for mentioning that.
When I went to South Africa last year, we did 3 memory cafes in a coffee house, and it was the first time they had ever had any kind of meeting with people living with dementia and Alzheimer's. And surprisingly, we had at least 50 people for each session show up. And for many of them, they had no idea that there were other people around who shared their diagnosis. So it was a way for them to network and to no longer feel alone and isolated, and to know that there are other people like them who are getting through this thing. So it was a wonderful experience. I really, really enjoyed it.
Great, great. Thank you for sharing that. It kind of reminds me of some of the principles and ideas behind peer support that have come up as well, right? Just the power of people coming together. Awesome. We got another kind of a set of questions that I would say were all about how do we balance the sometimes conflicting goals of self-determination and dignity of risk with protection from harm. So questions about, what if a person, doesn't believe that they have dementia and they are, at risk of harming themselves or others, of self-neglect. How do we support and empower and provide services and support in a person-centered way in those circumstances, really balancing, I guess, the important to important for. And for this one, maybe Elias, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, that's definitely a high priority in the location in which I work. And there's a thing that Dr. Kemp talks about called cognitive ramps, as well as training to a point. So for instance, we often in the past would think that a knife was an incredibly scary item to have, and that maybe a person with advanced dementia should not be allowed to have a knife. However, they've used it for the entirety of their life, chances are. So they have a lot of muscle memory that makes it very easy for them to manipulate a knife, and they've used it forever. So it's also having the ability to be willing to stand there and say, hey, let's give this a try, and support them without feeling like you are patronizing them in any way. And it's a difficult balance, but the cognitive ramps, and I'm sure Dr. Kemp can shed just a bit more light on it, but you basically do reminders in locations surrounding the exits and doors. If someone likes to wander, maybe they get a little bit anxious about being in the same place for a long time. Wandering can be a relatively dangerous thing if someone is not familiar with their surroundings. So we do some cognitive ramps in the exits to remind them it's a safe place, it's this home. We've also led them to have very personalized room entrances so they can easily find their room and door for those that have advanced dementia that might have a more difficult time finding where their particular home is. And so we made it as easy as absolutely possible to safely get back to your room whenever that's made. So
I
I
have
hope
a
that
question I have a question for Cameron. How do you bring up the subject of taking away keys?
Yeah, so this ties into the general question that Bevan was talking about. And I would also say that it's not just a dementia thing, but it's a challenge that's faced by any, for example, physical therapist, occupational therapist who wants, for example, to make sure that when a person has had a hip replacement, they do not sit down and cross their legs, because that could throw the surgery off. How do you convince a person to do something that's for their own good, but they may not either want to do it or may not believe that they have to do it? Okay. So this is like a general purpose thing, up to and including, the keys. And so I'll give you like a generic human answer. Okay. First, if a person doesn't believe that they should do something like not drive or not cross their legs or follow a physical therapy regimen, if they don't believe that they should be doing this, okay, then with or without dementia, when you're gone, they'll go back to the old approach, or if they have diabetes, they'll be eating candy. You know this, okay? And so first, it's about an issue of motivation, of getting them to believe that it's in their own best interest to not do something or to follow a different regimen. So where are they going to get that motivation? And what we say is you have to find someone that they trust, who they will listen to. And if you're the primary caregiver, it's probably not you. It's probably a physician or a lawyer or a banker or a clergyman or a friend who's their own age, who can sit down with them and say, listen, I don't want to see you dead in 2 years and attending your funeral. And you may not believe other people, but I'm telling you to believe me. So it's one of those hard conversations that you have to have, but it helps if it comes from someone that's coming from a position of trust and who the person believes isn't going to BS them. All right. Then when you have dementia, you also have to have that conversation present when the individual isn't there, because they'll forget. It's easy to forget that conversation. So you record the conversation, you print the conversation so that as a cognitive ramp, it can be brought back when the person has forgotten that and say, well, why shouldn't I drive my car? Okay. I mean, it could be something like, if you drive, all right, but your insurance is going to go through the roof and so will mine. It has to make sense to the person as to why they should do or not do something. This is human stuff, okay? And it has very little to do with dementia other than adding on some cognitive ramps.
Cynthia, Brian, anything to add? We have just 1 more minute.
I would just say I have a circle of support of people that I trust who will hold up the mirror for me, because I'm mindful that I may not be the best person to judge my abilities. So I've signed agreements in terms of driving, that when the time comes, my kids have my permission to help me move forward, even though I may be kicking and screaming and say terrible things, that it's from a place of love, and hopefully we'll get through that together. But I think, Cameron, your ideas are really helpful for all of us. Thank you.
Cynthia, I basically have done the same thing by holding up the mirror and having people around to, speak the truth to me. We may not want to hear it all the time, but, living alone has its challenges, but it can be done because you're doing it and I'm doing it. So
There we go.
I love that. Speak the truth to me. Wow. Well,
Ouch.
Our heartfelt thanks to the four of you. What a fantastic presentation. You're getting all kinds of love in the chat box. I'm really glad for the hundreds of people who joined us. Welcome to the NCAPS community, or welcome back. And I have learned a lot, and I know everyone else has too. So our big thanks. Connor, if you want to just put up the last poll, if you could please, before you go, we like to use data and information to continuously improve our webinars. So there are 6 questions here for you to quickly click through before you go off to your day. That'll give us information so that we can continue to improve these webinars. We are taking a break for the month of December, and then we're hoping to we'll have another webinar on January 6th, and you'll get some emails to register for that. So thank you to everyone, particularly to Cynthia, Brian, Cameron, and Elias. And we'll see you again in a few weeks.
Bye.